Hello, hi. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Oxford Martin School. My name is Alex Leveringhaus. I'm a James Martin Fellow here in the school, and I'm also a moral philosopher, and I work on, I'm just wrapping up a big project on the future of warfare and on new combat technologies. A couple of things. This event is being filmed. So for a philosopher, I have to be on very good behavior tonight, but just to make you aware that the event is being filmed, and also to make you aware that, of course, at the Oxford Martin School, we've done some work on drones and on new weapon systems, and this has come out in December as part of a policy paper here, which you might want to look at if you're interested in the topic. For some further information, there will be some copies just out on the desk in the corridor. Have a look at it. It doesn't really talk very much about the whole targeted killing debate. It talks more about the next step in drone technology, but still, for those interested in the future of warfare, it would be, I guess, something very interesting to look at. It's my great pleasure tonight to introduce Chris Woods from the Bureau of Investigative Journalists. Chris and I first met in 2013. I think at the Royal United Services Institute, where we were involved in a report for the Whitehall paper series on hitting the target, published by Sir Mike Aronson. And then I think we've sort of bumped into each other sort of every once in a while. Chris has been to a couple of events here at Oxford on drone technology and the humanitarian sector. And Chris also has, of course, been to a number of events on so-called autonomous weapons, which represents sort of the next generation of drones in military technology. Tonight, Chris will be speaking on his new book, A Sudden Justice. Although the question is justice, should it be seen in quotation marks, or should we really consider what is happening in drone warfare as justice? So there will be some questions, I guess, about the title. It's the outcome of considerable research on American drone warfare, and represents really quite a detailed account of what's been happening in drone warfare. And I'm really chuffed that we've got Chris here with us tonight. Chris, over to you.
Thank you very much, everyone, for coming tonight. It's really appreciated. I've still got a bit of straw in my hair. I've just come from the Hay Festival, and I've been sitting in a field for the last couple of days. So just bear with me while I pull this up. I thought I'd talk about the law tonight, about international law. That's probably making some people wince already. Just as a show of hands, I just wonder how many lawyers are in the room, and student lawyers. How many have we got? Just a few. It's going to be fairly generalist, though. And the reason I thought I'd talk about the law was twofold. I just did a book tour in the United States. And very interestingly, a lot of what the book, Sudden Justice, looks at, and what I'm really going to be talking about tonight, is the use of armed drones off the regular battlefield. 80% of drone strikes actually happen on the conventional battlefield. They're not controversial, governed by the laws of war, run by the regular military. But of course, they're not the drone strikes that get the headlines. The drone strikes that capture the headlines are the ones carried out by the CIA, by special forces in places like Yemen and Pakistan. And it's those that I'm going to talk about tonight. And on that book tour, I kind of realized that the legality of these strikes has disappeared from American discourse. It's simply not part of the narrative within the United States anymore. Outside the United States, it's often the first point that people engage on. Are these lawful? Is this moral? Should this be happening? And I'm interested in how that situation's come about. The other reason I thought I'd touch on the law tonight, which Alex was saying, is Oxford played a part in the book. And so, for example, there was a UN investigation a couple of years back, which some of you might have heard of, by two of the UN Special Rapporteur, Christoph Haynes and Ben Emerson, QC, and a couple of those workshops were held here in Oxford. People like Professor Dapo Akande very much involved in that. So I came to Oxford quite a bit during research for the book, and I shadowed that UN investigation for quite a time. What I thought I'd talk about is in terms of the legality of targeted killing. So what do we mean by a targeted killing? That is the use of an armed drone to pick out someone away from the hot battlefield in somewhere like Pakistan or Yemen, a country with which the United States is not at war, target them and kill them. The term that's come to be used since the early 2000s is targeted killing. The preferred UN term is more usually extrajudicial killings, and that has been the term that's framed the UN discourse around this. Colin Powell kind of got around that. He coined the phrase targeted assassination, which I think is quite useful as a sort of bridge between those two ideas. Colin Powell, former US Secretary of State. And I thought I'd look at two nations. We talk about the US's targeted killing program quite a lot. We don't really talk about Israel's. And Israel is the other country that has a formal, if you like, targeted killing program, and has had it for about the same length of time as the United States. So for the book, I was able not only to talk to a lot of US officials and former officials about their program, but I was very pleased to get some former, fairly high-ranking Israel Defense Force legal experts to talk to me about their processes. And I think when you compare the American and the Israeli programs side by side, there are some very interesting differences there that you wouldn't necessarily expect, that shine some light on, I think, particularly on American foreign policy. So with Israel, I mean, Israel began the targeted killing trend, if you like. Israel had assassinated, historically, I think we're all aware that Israel has carried out killings in the past. It's targeted terrorists, it's targeted Nazis, and it has killed over a period of decades. But they were occasional killings, usually cloaked in great levels of secrecy. Details would sometimes leak out, and so on. What changed was the Second Intifada, which was in 2000, the struggle between the Palestinians and the Israeli state. And just a couple of months into the Second Intifada, Israel began a much more formal killing program, which was quasi-public. They began assassinating key Palestinian leaders in the West Bank, in Gaza, and some processes began evolving around that. And we moved to this system of a quasi-public targeted killing program. Israel is quite strange on this because a lot of its policies, a lot of its actions, a lot of its technologies are very classified. So for example, if you're an Israeli journalist, you can't describe Israel's drone program, armed drone program. It's illegal. It's censored by the state. You have to refer to the New York Times referring to Israel's armed drone program, and that's actually how Israeli journalists get around it. So the Israeli program exists in this sort of half in, half out of the shadows world. Assassination for the United States, again, the United States had been a frequent assassinator. That became a problem, and in the 1970s, the Senate held a series of sessions which came to be known as the Church Committee, where the CIA was hauled up publicly and held to account for some of its actions, particularly in South and Central America. Assassination was a big part of that. And that led to President Gerald Ford issuing an executive order which banned agencies like the CIA from carrying out assassination. And that order pretty much held from about 1976 through to 2001. So successive US presidents, we have Ford, then we have Carter, Reagan, George Bush Sr., and Clinton, all then follow this same line that assassination is outlawed by executive order. But even prior to 9/11, for the United States, that starts to crumble, and it starts to crumble under Clinton. What changed things was the East African embassy bombings of 1998, for those with good memories, and I'm guessing some in the room probably weren't born then. 1998, Al-Qaeda blew up two US embassies, one in Tanzania, one in Kenya, killing, I think, just under 400 people, most of them local people who were just on their way to work, passers-by. A few Americans were killed, a few CIA operatives actually killed. That's only recently come out. So the ban on assassination was still in place. But Clinton began to sort of push at the edges of that. And I'm just going to read you the occasional quote from the book. In his memoirs, John Rizzo, who was the CIA's longtime acting general counsel, recounts 3 separate memoranda of notification for Bill Clinton between May 1998 and February 1999, so within quite a short period of time, each with contradictory positions. With the first, and I'm quoting Rizzo here, the Clinton White House was only talking about capturing bin Laden, not knocking him off. A second memorandum signed after the US embassy bombings allowed the CIA to kill bin Laden only if capture was not feasible. And then there was the final memorandum, which Rizzo says Clinton personally scratched out an acknowledgement that bin Laden might be killed. And as Rizzo says, taking the concept of mixed presidential signals to a whole new perilous level. So we have these contradictory signals coming from the presidency. They want people like bin Laden killed. Nobody's quite sure whether it's lawful to do it. The executive orders are still in place. There are these memoranda of notification which effectively organized the CIA. And also the CIA didn't want to kill. The CIA was nervous of assassinating. It was nervous of the legal blowback. There was a well-documented meeting literally a week before 9/11 of George Bush's senior cabinet members, those cabinet members who had an interest in national security issues. So the armed drone, the Predator, had only been effectively weaponized 3 days into George Bush's presidency. That's the first time they put a missile under the wing and fired it without the wing falling off. They were doing trial runs using the Predator to bomb a mock-up of Osama bin Laden's farmhouse before 9/11, about 3 months before 9/11. The CIA was practicing assassinating Osama bin Laden. But they had this meeting at the White House a week before 9/11, discussing, do we use the Predator to kill Osama? And they put it on pause. And the reason they put it on pause was because neither the CIA nor the Pentagon wanted responsibility for assassination. They thought that it would lead them into terrible trouble with the courts, with Congress. 9/11, of course, comes along, and literally within days, the ban on assassination is thrown out. George W. Bush signs a major memorandum of understanding on the 17th of September, so 6 days after 9/11, which really clears the way for an awful lot of things that then happened in the war on terror. There's a very interesting tension between Israel and the United States at this period. So as I mentioned, Israel is assassinating, it's killing. For those who are really interested in this story, there's a fantastic book called A High Price by Daniel Byman, and I would very much recommend you have a read of that. The Bush administration, so this is after Bush comes in early 2001, was vehemently opposed to Israeli assassinations, Israeli targeted killings. So there is this period prior to 9/11 where the United States criticizes Israel for its killings, for its assassinations. Former US Senator George Mitchell was the lead author of an April 2001 report into the Second Intifada. That report was commissioned by Clinton and inherited by Bush, and it concluded that the Israel Defense Force should abandon the blanket characterization of the current uprising as an armed conflict short of war, which fails to discriminate between terrorism and protest. Basically, the Israelis were changing the definition of war to sort of say that what they were doing with these assassinations was lawful. And the United States came down very hard against that. No, you can't do that. And in fact, an IDF official told me, former senior IDF legal official, quote, when Senator Mitchell rejected that premise, he was in fact rejecting the underlying logic of all of Israel's targeted killing policies. 2 months before 9/11, US Ambassador Martin Indyk adds to the pressure. He goes on Israeli television and says, quote, the United States government is very clearly on record as against targeted assassination. They are extrajudicial killings, and we do not support that. And after 9/11, 2 months after 9/11, we have a State Department official insisting, quote, that we oppose the policy of targeted killings. That has not changed. But of course, in truth, everything was changing because of 9/11. So there's a narrative that's been written over the years that implies that America was always comfortable, that Bush was always comfortable with targeted killings. It's not true. The Bush administration was aggressively against targeted killings until it started doing them itself. The first American assassination, the first American targeted killing by drone, happens in November 2002, and it happens in Yemen. The CIA basically had complete control of the American armed drone fleet between 2001 and 2004. The regular US Air Force weren't allowed to have their own armed drones until 2004, so only the CIA had them. They used them very specifically. The CIA flew them, for example, in Afghanistan. During the invasion, the war for Afghanistan, it was the CIA that flew those drones. And in fact, I write in the book the very first, unfortunately, the very first CIA drone operation, the very first time any drone had been used anywhere in a lethal operation of any kind, the CIA completely botched it and allowed Mullah Omar to escape on the very first night of the War on Terror. And there's a couple of quite fruity quotes from the two American generals that commanded that air war, who I cite in the book, who had no control over the CIA's drone that night. So the CIA botched the killing of Mullah Omar. Mullah Omar escapes. So the CIA is the only part of the US military intelligence complex that has the weapon. And in 2002, with these new powers that they have from George W. Bush, they begin assassinating. And they're chosen, the first time they use them, away from the hot battlefield, and I'm going to get into why that is such a problem in a moment, is Yemen. There was, the year before 9/11, there was a US warship called the USS Cole that had pulled into Aden Harbor in Yemen for refueling and taking on supplies. Al-Qaeda rammed the Cole with a little dinghy that was stuffed with explosives, and it blew a hole in the side of the ship and killed 17 American sailors. There was an aggressive hunt, even prior to 9/11, for the perpetrators of that attack. It had been predominantly focused on law and order issues by the Americans. So the FBI was working with the Yemeni Secret Service, for example. They had a lot of the people involved in the Cole bombing incarcerated. But then the CIA, working with the Pentagon and the White House, decided to do something different. They decided to assassinate as well. And they found an individual called al-Hariri, who was not the prime architect of the Cole bombing, but he was a key figure in it. And he was very high on America's wanted list. They tracked him for days with a Predator drone through the desert of Yemen, and then eventually killed him and 5 other men when they bombed a vehicle on a desert road in Yemen. There was an American citizen in that vehicle as well, a man called Kamal Darwish. So the very first American airstrike away from the hot battlefield, the very first assassination, also targeted and killed an American citizen. And as some of you may know, American citizens are constitutionally protected. The state cannot execute their own citizens without due process. And there's a big fudge around the killing of this man, Kamal Darwish, and for a long time, it was hidden that the CIA knew he was there all along. And in fact, it only emerged in 2010 through a journalist called Dana Priest from the Washington Post that the CIA knew this man Darwish was there, but killed him anyway. One thing that's never been reported, but I do write about in the book, is there was a survivor of that drone strike back in 2002. 6 men died. A 7th man escaped, a man called Abdul Rauf Nassib. He crawled away, and because the Predator drone only carries a maximum of 2 missiles on it, very small missiles, the Hellfire with a small explosive yield, and often the Americans used to take one of the missiles off to give the drones longer in the air. They didn't have another missile to kill him, and he escaped. The Yemenis caught this man, Nassib, in 2004, and they put him on trial. in Yemen's Special Penal Court. And that was a military court. By then, Yemen was very much committed to the war on terror. The Yemen government owed this man no favors, but he was found not guilty. And I think there's a very interesting thing for us to consider. The issue of the US as judge, jury, and executioner. We often hear that said, but here we have an individual in that first ever targeted killing who survives, he goes on trial, and he's found not guilty. And I think that does raise some uncomfortable questions. He did actually end up in the end joining Al-Qaeda and became a commander with Al-Qaeda in 2012. He was caught again, and by then he was an Al-Qaeda commander. But we don't know cause and effect. We don't know whether he was radicalized before that strike or after. We do know that he was held for 2 additional years by the Yemenis in prison, even after being found not guilty, under pressure from the American government. So we don't know what exactly radicalized him. We know he was radicalized. So we have this first targeted killing by the Americans in 2002, and that's the point that the UN gets involved. That's the point that the international community starts to express concern that we're moving from a situation where states occasionally assassinate to a more formal killing program. And there are concerns expressed about it. Sweden's foreign minister goes on the record to complain of, quote, a summary execution that violates human rights. Amnesty demands that the United States should issue a clear and unequivocal statement that it won't sanction extrajudicial executions in any circumstances, and that any US officials found to be involved in such actions will be brought to justice. And the UN jumps in really within weeks of that first assassination through what is now the UN Human Rights Council. The UN has a number of what are known as special rapporteurs. They're special investigators. They have a very tough job. They have particular jurisdictions. Some look at housing, some look at migrants, and in this case, there is a UN special rapporteur for extrajudicial killings. And drones were immediately placed in that box by the UN, because that's what the view was in terms of international law. These are extrajudicial killings, killings outside the law. And that really began a 13-year power struggle between the UN and the US, which is actually very one-sided. The UN hasn't done very well out of that. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. But even now that the US has begun targeting killings, the US government is not speaking with one voice on this. The State Department, under Colin Powell, is still fighting a reaction to view these targeted killings as assassinations, as extrajudicial killings. And there's a remarkable email in WikiLeaks, which is a note from the US ambassador to Yemen, a man called Edmund Hall. And Hall sends a very tart note to the State Department's Near Eastern Affairs section. So every year the State Department issues a book of what all the countries in the world and how good or bad they are on human rights. And the State Department had sent out a draft, and they were going to label the CIA's missile attack in Yemen as an extrajudicial killing. They were going to label themselves as extrajudicial killers. And Edmund Hall kicks off completely about this, and his letter says, in President Bush's State of the Union address, the Predator attack on November 3rd against Al-Qaeda was highlighted as a success in the war on terror. It is inconsistent that a report from the State Department would indicate that the same killing is extrajudicial or lawful. And Hall instructs them to remove this wording. And in fact, you can look at Hall's email and the final printed version of the State Department report that did come out. And in fact, they use his wording and not the original wording. So there's this rearguard battle within the US government, with State Department still very powerful early on in the war on terror, diminished eventually, trying to hold the US to international law. But it was a rearguard action, and it really, now that America was in the targeted killing business, it meant that they couldn't really pressure Israel anymore. And Lawrence Wilkerson, who was Colin Powell's chief of staff, I asked him how. He said, the response we got from them was, "Are you shitting me? You're doing it," which I thought was quite straightforward, quite blunt of him. So suddenly we see the State Department drop, and suddenly by about 2003, 2004, the US is talking with one voice, and that one voice is, we are in the targeted killing business, and the legality of it is our affair, not your affair. That was the message back to the UN and back to the international community. So I talked a lot about the legality. So are these drone killings away from the battlefield lawful? It's the biggest question, I think. In some circumstances, they are. I think that is I think when you talk to IHL lawyers, IHRL lawyers, that there are circumstances in which international law allows you to carry out an attack on the territory of another nation without their consent, for example, or with their consent when you're not at war in that country. And that's around issues like imminence, immediate self-defense, when you think there's going to be an attack by Al-Qaeda, for example, that puts your citizens at direct risk. So I think there's a view that not all drone strikes in places like Pakistan or Yemen or Somalia are unlawful. There are going to be times when there are lawful strikes away from the battlefield. But most of them, it's also generally the view internationally, are not lawful. And I think also the challenge became the scale of the killings, because we went from individual killings, the one killing a year, to 5 a year, to 10 a year, to hundreds and hundreds a year. By the time Obama comes in, I think the high point of targeted killings was 110 drone strikes in Pakistan in 2010, which killed just under 1,000 people. We're talking a huge program, a lot of strikes. The strikes also moved the next year into Yemen and Somalia under Obama and so on. And for those who haven't seen it, there's a fantastic movie, an Israeli movie called The Gatekeepers, which interviews all the surviving heads of Shin Bet, the Israeli security service. A really great movie. And one of those former heads of Shin Bet talks about Israel's killing program. He said the issue was never starting the program. The issue was we were killing so many in the end that it became a conveyor belt, and nobody knew how to turn the program off anymore. So I think that's one of the challenges. Once states get used to killing and build a process around killing, it gets quite difficult to manage that and turn that off again. The UN's position on targeted strikes away from the battlefield has been pretty consistent. As I say, the UN Human Rights Council has labelled them as extrajudicial killings right from the start. And the UN Special Rapporteur has always been the rapporteur for extrajudicial killings. It's worth noting, you may have seen in the news a couple of years ago that Ben Emerson QC actually did meet with the CIA director, John Brennan, and that was described as a big breakthrough, that the CIA did at last meet with someone from the UN and discuss targeted killing after all these years. I think the reason Emerson met with John Brennan was because he wasn't the special rapporteur for extrajudicial killings. In fact, that was a joint investigation between Christoph Haynes, who was the extrajudicial killing rapporteur, and Emerson, who's in fact the special rapporteur for counterterrorism and human rights. And I asked Ben, did Christoph actually get invited to that same meeting at CIA headquarters? And Ben said, no, of course not, So I think the Americans were sending a message there. They would talk to Emerson because of his role in counterterrorism. They would not even recognize the authority of the rapporteur with responsibility for extrajudicial killings. And the American pushback against the UN has been very, very aggressive. Philip Alston,
who was the rapporteur before Christoph Haynes. He's now at NYU. He quite aggressively took on the CIA's assassination program, which had begun in Pakistan in 2004. So we had the first killing in 2002 away from the battlefield. It's then another 2 years before the CIA does this again in Pakistan, and they just did it once in 2004. In 2005, they did it twice. A very slow start. It's why I call Bush in the book the occasional assassin. He very rarely assassinated early on. But nevertheless, the UN jumped in. And the pushback from the US was fascinating. And I'm quoting Alston here. He says that when the United States did engage, it, quote, took the opportunity to challenge the entire international human rights system, arguing that international human rights law did not apply to the incident, that the laws that did apply could not be addressed by the Special Rapporteur or implicitly by the Human Rights Council, and that each state could determine for itself whether any particular incident could be addressed by the Council. Now, for those who remember how the Bush presidency ran things in the early years of the War on Terror, that chimes very closely with how they ran torture and rendition and Guantanamo as well. It was basically two fingers to the rest of the world, and you can locate their response to the criticisms of drone killings in that same space, I think. And there's an argument that says that the drone-targeted killings came out of that same legal black hole that torture came out of. The international community, 198 out of 200 nations, saying that they're almost always unlawful, and yet the US goes down this road of assassination, then you could argue that that comes out of the same contempt for international law that the Bush administration showed early on. Israel also pushed back against the UN. It didn't recognize the UN's jurisdiction and wasn't happy with it. But I think this is where it gets quite interesting. Israel also adopted a very different approach to the United States in the way it approached the legality, the lawfulness of the targeted strikes. And I explore this quite a bit in the book. So early on, with the early Israeli assassinations, they just did it. They just got on with it. But there was one particular killing in early 2001 of a man called Dr. Tabat Ahmed Sabah, that senior IDF lawyers were asked by their commanders for an opinion on the lawfulness of his killing. So when Sabat had been killed, some had insisted he was focused on Israeli-Palestinian reconciliation, that he was not a militant. And this created controversy. It was the killings before him hadn't caused too much of a noise, but Sabat's killing did. And this is quoting a senior former IDF lawyer who I spoke to. We called him Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde because during the day he was a peace activist and a physician, but in the night he actually operated terror squads. That was the IDF's claim. That was never put to test in the courts. They killed him, but it created controversy. As a result of this incident, the chief of staff of the Israel army actually turned to us and said, "Is it legal for us to specifically target identified terrorists?" And I think that's fascinating. They were quite into the killing program before their commander-in-chief turned around and said, "Is this lawful?" And I think that's often the way with military actions. The law sometimes follows on and they kind of create the rationale sometime further down the line. And that's what happened with the Israeli. The lawyers were asked, is this lawful? Can you construct an argument that will stand up in the courts that says we can do this? And the IDF decided that this was something that they should push through the courts. So the IDF pushed all the way to the Israeli Supreme Court the question of whether targeted killings were lawful. And the Israeli Supreme Court ruled on that in 2006, and their ruling is actually fascinating. So the Israeli Supreme Court came back and said they are neither lawful nor unlawful. I know that sounds like a fudge. What the Supreme Court was saying is every time you carry out a targeted killing or want to carry out a targeted killing, you've got to judge it in isolation. There's no blanket rule that says you can, there's no blanket rule that says you can't. Does it conform to all of these processes that place it within international law? Then you can kill. And you talk to people like Ben Emerson, he thinks this is, you know, in terms of the legal position, it's probably the best, he describes it as the best black letter law situation out there, that the Israelis have this position that in principle at least, allows them to kill in certain circumstances. I think where things get a bit more complicated with the Israelis is whether the sort of black letter law is actually followed through on the ground. And one of the challenges I think we have with the Israelis, and one of the contradictions, is that the United States, and there are many issues around the lawfulness of the United States actions in places like Pakistan, Yemen, Somalia, do go today, and it took them a while to get there, to fairly significant lengths to reduce the threat to civilians. It is arguable that even with a kind of clear legal position, the Israelis don't, at times, prioritise the preservation of civilian life when drones and other aircraft are involved. And we saw with the war on Gaza last year, horrific civilian casualties. The IDF itself conceded that 2 out of 3 of the people it killed in Gaza last year were non-combatants. So drones can be really valuable in those circumstances. They have this ability to loiter, they have small weapons on them, you can choose your moment of intervention, but without the political will to reduce civilian casualties, drones actually bring you almost no benefits at all on the battlefield. They're just another weapon system. And in some circumstances, I'm sure Alex is aware of this, drones are actually worse than manned aircraft because their field of vision is limited, they're not very good in urban environments and so on. There are places you don't want drones operating. And of course, Gaza is one of the most densely populated parts of the world, so drone strikes in Gaza may be a very bad thing indeed. But the Israelis had pushed the issue all the way to their Supreme Court. It had come back with this ruling. It said it's neither lawful nor unlawful. And a very nice comment from the IDF lawyer who'd kind of steered it to this point. This is quoting him. "It was proof positive that we were supervised. And also, when you write such a legal opinion, no matter how many lawyers you consult, it's still a very lonely thing to do. But when you have the Supreme Court of the State of Israel checking what you did and coming up with some fine-tuning, even changing some of the things we wrote, that's absolutely fine, because it gives you the confidence that you're no longer alone." So that's the situation we end up with Israel fairly early on in 2006. That same year, by the way, was the first time, in fact, the US Supreme Court clarified that the United States was even in an armed conflict as international law understood it. The Bush administration was gerrymandering, if you like, the way that it used international law to allow things like Guantanamo to exist, and that had to be pushed to the Supreme Court, which then ruled that the United States was in what's known as a non-international armed conflict. But it was 5 years into the war on terror before we could even get the Americans to clarify for us what form of war they were involved in. War, as defined by the Red Cross, is a binary thing. There are only 2 forms of war, an international armed conflict or a non-international armed conflict. The Americans said, we're in neither and both. And nobody really knew what to do with that until the Supreme Court kind of pushed them there. So we did get a ruling out of the Supreme Court that at least admitted America was at war, which everybody knew, of course. What the Americans would not do, and still will not do, was allow the courts domestically within the United States or the UN or any international body to engage on the lawfulness of their program. So where we have the IDF pursuing this very clear process, they end up at the Supreme Court. The Americans go to enormous efforts to block off the American courts from ever engaging on the legality of their program. So there are 2 layers to the lawfulness of the drones. The first is domestic law, American domestic law. The United States passed something called Authorization for the Use of Military Force in early 2001, and the memorandums of understanding I mentioned, they're the basis of American domestic law. That's how America says these are lawful. Domestic law matters to America. If domestic law is the bit they're scared of. Then there's the international law, international humanitarian law, the laws of war. and that's a whole other issue. AUMF, as it's usually known, is still on the table after 2001, and there's a lot of dispute about why it's even on the table. Al-Qaeda's pretty much been destroyed. The Al-Qaeda that launched 9/11, it's emerged into other organizations. John Brennan has described it as a cancer that's infected the body, but it's very hard to look at Islamic State today, for example, and understand how that's connected to the Al-Qaeda that launched 9/11 13, 14 years ago. And yet the same justifications and legal justifications in American law are still underpinning the whole campaign. And in fact, Obama right now can't push through a replacement authorization because Congress is blocking him. And the only thing I got Michael Hayden to say to me on the record for the book, he's the former director of the CIA, was about the AUMF. And he said the tether between some of the things in my mind that seem appropriate and lawful and due and necessary with the current threat, and we were talking about Islamic State, the tether from that action, I guess he was viewing it as a balloon, as the tether from that action as justification back to the original AUMF is getting very, very taut. So even very senior US intelligence officials, defense officials, they knew that the AUMF didn't really work. It wasn't really fit for purpose anymore. But this was underpinning the whole domestic legality of the targeted killings. And Obama himself said just a couple of years ago pretty much the same thing. This is Obama. The AUMF is now nearly 12 years old. The Afghan war is coming to an end. Core al-Qaeda is a shell of its former self. Groups like al-Qaeda in Yemen must be dealt with, but in the years to come, not every collection of thugs that labels themselves al-Qaeda will pose a credible threat to the United States. Unless we discipline our thinking, our definitions, our actions, we may be drawn into more wars that we don't need to fight, or continue to grant presidents unbound powers more suited for traditional armed conflicts between nation states. So you have presidents like Obama unhappy with the vast powers that they've been given by the AUMF, but also simultaneously not willing to give them back. And it's a kind of the typical president's thing. So that's domestic US law. Then you have international law. And as I say, 198 out of 200 states pretty much view these as unlawful. One US former intelligence official, I was asking them about America's closest allies and whether they shared potentially lethal targeting information with the CIA that could be used in drone strikes. And their answer was fascinating, was that no, because it could be used in actions which America's closest allies view as unlawful. So we're not just talking about, China and Russia and, Pakistan and whatever, who think that America's drone killings are unlawful. We're talking about Britain and France and Germany, the allies. And Western intelligence agencies will not share this kind of information because they are worried at their own kickback. And I was told by one of these officials, we are the only country on earth who thinks that we're in a global war with al-Qaeda and that we have the right to take the fight to the enemy outside of internationally agreed theatres of conflict. And even so, having said that, the same official said, under two incredibly different presidents, our behaviour hasn't changed at all, and if anything has become more on the targeted killing side under the constitutional lawyer president, he's talking about Obama, than it was under the cowboy oil man. You can probably work out who he meant there. So clearly there's a great comfort level in doing this. So they're the American assertions of lawfulness. There's an assertion all the time. The Obama administration did it, the Bush administration did it. These strikes are lawful. But every time a domestic American court has tried to examine the lawfulness of these strikes, it's been stopped by the government. The way they stop it is because, of course, the war is being fought by the CIA, predominantly, and by special forces. Its actions are highly classified in law, and that allows the CIA to use something called the GLOMAR defense. That means it can say, if you can test them on this, just send an email, send a letter to the CIA saying, do you carry out drone strikes in Pakistan? Anyone can do this. You'll get a letter back from the CIA saying, we can neither confirm nor deny the existence or non-existence of the claims and allegations in your letter. And that's the Glomar defense. Even the act of denying is as problematic as the act of confirming, therefore we neither deny. I mean, it's Schrodinger's assassin, you know. It's neither confirm nor deny existence or non-existence. And that's what they use to shut down American courts from examining the lawfulness of these strikes. But they do need examining. I think it matters to Americans. It matters internationally. There needs to be the engagement by the US court system. So a great deal of effort goes into preventing the courts from involving that. How does that play out? Well, it's usually spearheaded by the US Department of Justice. It's the one that usually brings these court cases. And they will even use the president's words against these cases. As some of you may know, there was an American preacher called Anwar al-Awlaki who was killed about 4 years ago. Awlaki was a moderate. He began as a moderate. In fact, he preached at the Pentagon after 9/11. He was invited for lunchtime prayers at the Pentagon 3 months after 9/11 and led prayers at the Pentagon. 10 years later, the Pentagon and CIA assassinated him because he'd gone over to Al-Qaeda, and his journey there is a really interesting one. I have no doubt he was Al-Qaeda by the time he was killed, but he was an American citizen. And as I was saying earlier, there's a constitutional protection to American citizens, and this is a big issue. We saw just the other week when the CIA accidentally killed a single American civilian. The Americans have probably killed 500 civilians in their drone strikes since 2002. The only time the president has ever stood up and said sorry was when they accidentally killed one American, and I think that's very uncomfortable for all of us. But of course, that's what happened. So when Awlaki was killed, it was a very hot issue within the United States. Obama claimed it as a positive thing, and Obama actually went on The Tonight Show, which is a hugely popular US chat show, and boasted about the fact that we, the United States, had killed Awlaki. And this is what Obama said: this was probably the most important Al-Qaeda threat that was out there after bin Laden was taken out, and it was important that working with the Yemenis, we were able to remove him from the field. So that's Obama on The Tonight Show in front of a massive American audience. We killed him. So this is very helpful to those groups campaigning for more transparency in the drone program. They can say, well, the president has admitted that we are assassinating, and we can talk about this now, and we can include this in the court cases. The Department of Justice then jump in, and they do this on a number of occasions, and I talk about others in the book that are equally surreal. The Department of Justice tries to slap this down, and here's what they say, quote, President Obama's statements did not identify what role the United States played in the events that led to Awlaki's death, and thus could not constitute an official acknowledgement that the US government was responsible. So you have the president saying, we killed him, and then the Department of Justice says, you can't take that as the president saying, we killed him. And this is the kind of fantasy world that the Department of Justice has kind of created, and it is driving federal judges insane. We have a situation where we know of the existence of 13 legal memos in the Department of Justice relating to the killing of Anwar al-Awlaki and other Americans. 8 of them are still being withheld. Americans are not allowed to see 8 of those 13 memos. And again, Mike Hayden, former head of the CIA, has said on the record, I'm uncomfortable with a situation where the legal basis for the drone war is locked up in a safe in the Department of Justice. As in, how can we fight a war when nobody knows the legal basis of it? There is a great quote from a US district judge, Rosemary Collier, who's been one of those who's really fought back about these American efforts to contain and control the court engagement. When she was told by the Department of Justice that the court should never have a role in ruling on the legality of the drone strike, she said, your argument is that the court has no role in this? None. I find that a little disconcerting. The scope of your argument concerns me. It gobbles up all the air in the room. The most important part of the United States is that it's a nation of laws. So the judiciary is fighting back. They're not happy, they're uncomfortable with this. And I think, you know, probably 10 years further down the line with the drone killing program, we may get a breakthrough. It may get to one of the higher levels of the federal court system. It might even get to the Supreme Court 2025, 2026, 20 years after the Israelis, and we might get a ruling. I think the interesting question then is whether American governments are prepared to even listen to that ruling. I think the challenge for the United States now, going back to that comment I made earlier from the former head of Shin Bet, is the conveyor belt. And I think the most troubling thing about the American drone program for me, and I spent 5 years researching this, is that what began as this very occasional killing program, an assassination here, an assassination there, has become sort of quasi-codified. It's become part of American foreign policy now, alongside trade, alongside diplomacy. And Obama's given a number of speeches where he's framed targeted killings in those exact terms as simply a plank of US policy. And I think the challenge for the next president, in 2017, she or he is going to have to decide whether they want to continue with this targeted killing program. That we don't strategically know whether it really works. Tactically, we know that it does, and we know that it's had some effect in damaging Al-Qaeda. Strategically, there's a lot of argument about whether it's delivered or not. But also there's the damage to the United States reputationally. I would argue that while it's not as bad as torture, I mean, the damage that torture did to the US was staggering. I think it's pretty much up there. And the international condemnation of the drone strikes, the drone wars, is pretty bad. And I also think it's probably a fairly effective recruiting tool for militants. But I think also, going back to David Kilcullen, who was one of the architects of the surge in Iraq in 2006 that helped to beat Al-Qaeda back in the first time around in Iraq. And then Kilcullen went on to become an advisor to Obama. He's described drones as being as addictive as catnip to politicians in Washington now, because they give these instant results, that the tactical works very well as far as news cycles are concerned. You can show that something's being done. Strategically, you may be destroying your chances further down the line, but it's all about the news cycle. People like Kilcullen argue. Well, that's where I'm going to leave it, really. That was probably a bit more depth on that than you were probably hoping for. But obviously, it's a much broader topic than that, and I'm sure there are going to be questions about lots of stuff other than the legality of this. But I'm going to leave it there, and very much looking forward to questions and anything you want to throw at me, please do. And thanks.
Thanks very much for the excellent presentation. We've got a roving mic for questions, so if you want to raise your hand if you have a question. I think I just want to very briefly raise 2 points, so just as general points, really. I mean, one point is, if you think about the role that technology plays in all of this. Of course, I mean, you can have drones, and drones, at the beginning at least, are primarily used for surveillance and observation and reconnaissance missions. That's what they're good at. And still, I mean, if you look at the use of armed drones, then the majority of drones is still unarmed, right? But, once you've got such a system, and once you have such a system that works, it's a very, very small step towards weaponizing it. So you can have a lot of systems that are probably not used by the military at all, or that are not used specifically for combat functions, but sometimes the step is very, very small towards a new weapon system that has an impact on how wars are fought. The other point is probably a more philosophical one, and that has something to do with the acceptability of drones. And I think a lot of people are frustrated when they talk to philosophers because they never get a straight answer. It's always, it depends. And the same could be said about drones, really. It depends whether the use of drones, whether the use of lethal force by drones is lawful on the kind of context in which they're used. I mean, you talked a lot about sort of cold battlefields or, away from hot battlefields. And of course, I mean, a drone as such is not an unlawful weapon. It's not an illegitimate weapon, but it very much depends on the use. And I guess the broader question is whether this war on terror, whether this targeted killing program by the United States, by Israel, sort of represents the shape of conflict to come in the 21st century in a way. So just sort of some sort of points thrown into the mix, just as a direct response to you. Does anyone have any questions? Caroline, the lady just next to you.
Hi, my name's Chelsea. Thank you very much for your presentation. I have a question and a comment. The comment is there was some investigative journalism in Australia over the last couple of years that actually the joint military base in the north... Pine Gap.
Yeah.
So it's a joint Australian-US base, but it does... A lot of the targeting information that goes into the program does come from there, and while people have been unable to get information from there, there's a kind of reasonable assumption that Australian personnel are contributing to sourcing and then transferring that information with knowledge. My question is, so only these programs have been in existence for quite some time, and it's really only the US and Israel that have pursued them. Why do you think that is, and what other countries have shown an interest in drones or shown an interest in kind of expanding them as a surveillance resource, which, as Alex said, could then lead to the next stage of weaponizing them?
I mean, there are three countries that presently use armed drones, and they each use them differently. So we have the US and Israel that I've spoken about tonight. The third country is the UK. And it's been involved in the drone program since 2004. They got in so I mentioned that the regular US Air Force wasn't allowed to have armed drones until 2004. The British got in on the ground floor with that at that time. They basically offered up key personnel to the Americans who flew American drone missions. The British identified armed drones very quickly as what they call a disruptive technology. That means they don't know the impact it's going to have on the way that we fight wars. And so they wanted to be part of that early on. They went to the Americans and they said, we're going to give you men and women to fly these drones, to run the intelligence. And the Americans said, thank you very much. And it was only 5 years later the British actually got their own armed Reapers, made by General Atomics. And in fact, even now, the British are still the only country that have ever been trusted by the Americans to fly their own drones. And the Israelis have never sold their armed drone technology to any country. So it's actually a very small club still on the big strategic drones flown remotely by satellite. China and Russia are a part of that now. Iran is. I don't think it will ever be more than the big powerful nations with deep pockets, big militaries, and who are quite active in combat. You know, where it gets a bit grayer is the tactical drones, where you kind of drop down the feeding chain, as it were. Tactical drones are much more common. They're already being fielded by non-state actors. So we know that Islamic State is using unarmed drones at the moment to recce cities, towns, installations before they're attacking them. The day before the United States began airstrikes in Syria, Hezbollah reported that it had carried out its first drone strike against Islamic State in Syria. It got almost no publicity because of what came in the next 24 hours, but that's, to my knowledge, the first time a non-state actor has used a quasi-strategic drone in the way that we've been used to with Israel or the United States. So it's coming, but I don't think it will ever be more than a small club of players. The risk to us as civilians is the tactical drones, the stuff that you can buy off the shelf and run off your iPhone, when they either get weaponized or used in swarm and they present a risk to civilians. But that's not really what I mean, the book is really about the big strategic drones with the missiles and bombs on them. Yeah.
But I mean, just to add to that, I mean, the big strategic drones, I mean, states also cooperate on this, right? So I think Britain and France have just signed a cooperation agreement. I think Germany, of course, does not want to use its drones outside of armed conflict, but yet I take it that a lot of German drone pilots are trained by the Israeli army. So there's a lot of cooperation going on.
But the British have never used their drones away from the hot battlefield, and they don't want to, they tell me. the rules of war that they used in Afghanistan, for example, were stepped back quite far from the edge of what they were permitted to do. So the British evolved a rule which they called a zero expectation of civilian casualties. You can kill civilians in war. The laws of war permit you to kill civilians. It's uncomfortable for us as civilians to consider that. The British actually evolved a way to use drones where they said they would only strike if there was a zero expectation. Israel and the US have both said they will not adopt that policy. So you get differences between the states in how they use the drones. And of course China, which has its own armed drone capability now, has categorically said it will not use drones in what it says are unlawful circumstances, which is what it describes the American drone program as. Yeah.
The lady at the front, in the black jumper.
Hi. I've been thinking about drones myself in my own work, and one of the questions that I had when I attended the workshop with Christoph Haynes and Ben Emerson was, how is it possible to clarify the position, the legality of this position in such a way that it makes it very clear to states that they're acting outside of the law? Well, it's very evident that participants in that workshop and in other workshops that I've been to with IHL and the Red Cross, that there's a lot of disagreement inside the international community as to exactly where the line is of legality. So I just wondered whether you could comment on that firstly. The second is, one of the issues that drones have is the kickback on law. So the ex post facto legal rationalizations that occur when the military steps ahead and does something, then create spaces within the law which didn't exist before. And so there's a tendency within the Israeli literature to look at the Israeli Supreme Court's work as a kind of exercise in legalizing and justifying something which gives some kind of comfort. Of course, it doesn't do anything to constrain targeted killing. So I think there's a complexity about the role that law plays in this whole story.
I think, Christoph Haynes, and for those who don't know his work, he's written some fantastic papers on this. And Haynes is, the best line I think Haynes has ever issued on this is, drones should follow the law, not the law the drones. And I think it's that straightforward. The law is really clear. And I think while there is debate about where the line should be on the targeted killings beyond the hot battlefield, there is near unanimous consensus outside of the US and Israel that it is not where the US and Israel are right now. So I think that the consensus among IHL lawyers, except within the United States, is that it's way back from where the United States has pushed it since 2002. The very interesting thing for me is when you go to the United States, and as I said right at the beginning, the question, all I talked about today was the law, and I'm sorry for boring you on that, but I think it is really, really important to go right back to the basics of this and say, is it lawful? You cannot ask that question in the United States. And there was a brilliant paper written by a Harvard lawyer last year, her name's Naz Modizadeh, and she talked about how the American legal system has effectively been compromised. Why? Because if you want a job, you can't go around saying this is unlawful. You can't, it's sort of pulled the whole system with it over to this side. And it's almost impossible to find any lawyer, IHL lawyer, within the US, and even some NGOs who will argue that these strikes are unlawful, which is fascinating to me. And from an outsider's perspective, I find that a curiosity. But I think there's a sort of creation of this sort of bubble within the United States. It's very difficult. For example, a lot of my work's focused on civilians, the killing of non-combatants. It's uncomfortable stuff that we don't want to be confronted with. Our militaries kill civilians. Wars are bad, civilians die. The CIA started spouting absolute fantasy a couple of years ago that they were no longer killing civilians on the battlefield. Their drones, they described drones to me as the most precise weapon in the history of warfare. If you think about that for 1 second, the most precise weapon in the history of warfare is a knife. We've had that for thousands of years. You hit what you want to hit. There's no collateral damage unless you're really doing that. You kill civilians with bombs and missiles. We can kill a lot less of them now. Weapons have become much, much more precise, and that's a very good thing. But it's also a very bad thing because it tempts politicians
to war where before they wouldn't have gambled that because they wouldn't want to risk the killing of 100 civilians. But now maybe they'll only kill 2 or 3. And I think, you know, there is an argument, and a coherent argument, that says that drones risk pulling down the threshold for war. And I'm kind of going slightly off your point here. So I think there's this issue, there's this fear around confronting around the legality, and there's this fear around confronting around what drones actually do, which is that they kill, and they're very good at killing.
Yeah, we've got the gentleman in the blue polo shirt just on the other side, right?
Nicolas Sölter. You mentioned the use of drones by the Israelis in the Gaza Strip. I did not really get that point because I think their drones function as a substitute for regular aircraft, you could say. So me, myself, I would see it as an improvement because, I mean, drones expand the time which you actually can use for making the decision whether to kill or not to kill. And if you talk about sudden justice, then I think we both would agree that a judge can only make a reasonable decision if his own head is not at stake, his own life is not at stake. So I don't really understand that point. And my second question, if we talk about a legal framework for drones, does it really make sense to specifically look at drones? Don't we have to look at the single mission, at the choice of the target? I mean, you mentioned yourself that there were like human agents killing targets before there were drones. I think that drones are simply a very efficient way of killing. We always see drones as something, well, as a technology we did not have 10 years ago, and I think that's completely wrong. If you look at the Cold War, there were drones that were much faster. They were simply not used for killing missions. As you said, there is some kind of moral hazard because it's a lot cheaper and you don't have the risk of losing your own
I'll
man.
jump in there because there's a lot of questions in there.
Yes.
So
the question is, does it make sense to specifically look at drones for the legal framework?
I would answer that with yes is my answer, not just because I've just written a book about it, and you know, so I clearly think there's something to it. But in the 1980s, the tribal areas of Pakistan were the sanctuary for the Mujahideen, which was CIA-backed at that point, to launch its attacks on Soviet forces occupying Afghanistan. There were no-go areas on the planet. There is something revolutionary about armed drones. It was a capability we simply did not have before 1994. It did not exist on the planet, which was the ability to satellite link in real time, to analyze in real time, and then that becomes weaponized in 2001. This is a unique battlefield capability that battlefield commanders had only dreamed of. And now there is no go. You know, the Fatah is where most of the drone strikes have happened. When Al-Qaeda was driven out of the cities in Pakistan, mostly by law and order measures, by the way, by the CIA, FBI, Pakistani intelligence rolling up Al-Qaeda by arresting people. We used to arrest people before we killed them, by the way. They retreated to Fatah thinking they would be safe. They didn't know the drones had been invented. They were kind of aware of what they had done. The drones meant that there was no longer a no-go space. So I think they have changed warfare. I think they bring a precision that simply is not available to other aircraft. It's simply not. But going back to your point of bombing, for example, Israel and the occupied territories, and I kind of mentioned this in brief, the drones work to the benefit of non-combatants if there's the political will to do that. The issue is what weapons you put on your armed drones. So, for example, the British took, there are 2 missiles that can be carried on the Reaper drone. One is the Hellfire, which we've all heard of. It's a 90-pound missile, about 40 pounds of explosives in it. In fact, the Americans these days sometimes use concrete variants of the Hellfire. They don't have any explosives in them at all. They simply use the kinetic energy from the missile that when it hits a car will kill everybody in that car. But there's no external detonation unless the petrol tank goes up, because there's no explosive in there. It's the kinetic energy that kills. These are very, very precise and low-yield missiles. There's a second missile that can go on a Reaper that the Americans still use and the British now don't, which is called a GBU-12. And it's a 500-pound high explosive bomb that was designed to burrow through runways, and the Americans use that on the Reaper when they have what's called a high-value target, or they want to guarantee a kill. And the damage from that missile is catastrophic. It destroys everything in a very significant range. And I spoke to drone operators, and I speak to a lot of drone operators in the book, by the way. I mean, the book is based on first-hand experiences of people who ran the campaign. You know, one describes bringing down half a mountain when she drops a GBU-12 on a group of Taliban that had American troops under fire. So back to your point about Israel, if you're using missiles, high explosive missiles, in an urban area, you are going to kill civilians. There is almost no way you can, even if you can use kinetic-only variants, then sure, but of course that's not the effect that Israel was trying to achieve. And is it just part of a mix of aircraft? Yes. It's absolutely, it's always a choice. You know, when they were deciding how to kill Osama bin Laden, one of the choices was to use a drone. They felt that they couldn't guarantee anything and it couldn't deliver. One of their options was to send in B-1 bombers and flatten the entire neighborhood. And the US even modeled the death toll that would impose and whether that would have been acceptable. That was part of the number crunching that went on. In the end, it was decided that it was ground troops that were needed to carry that. So it's always a choice. But there are some parts of the world where the drone is the only choice. So for example, in Yemen right now, US ground forces are gone. The US embassy is closed. The only thing the Americans have left in Yemen are the CIA's drones, and they're still killing Al-Qaeda. So sometimes the drones are all that they have in those remote places. So hopefully that answers.
I guess there's the question coming up there, Chris, on, you know, in ways sort of assuming drones didn't exist. If drones didn't exist, would they still run a sort of killing program? I mean, one wonders how challenging it would be. But would they still run a killing program by, for example, using attack helicopters, you know, flying them from Afghanistan into these sort of tribal areas, you know, bombing them, high altitude bombing, all these sorts of methods that have been used? Or is it really drones that makes this war of terror possible?
I think it's the capability that they bring, the unique capability. And when the British were winding down in Afghanistan, the curious thing about the British Reapers is they've never flown in British airspace. We acquired those weapons during the Afghan war. They were sent straight to Afghanistan. And European aviation law prevents flying them in British airspace. And the British were umming and ahhing, what are we going to do with our drones? And I had talks with very senior British military officials who were seriously considering sending Britain's Reapers to the Horn of Africa, to Djibouti, where America is fighting a counterinsurgency in Somalia and Yemen that the British have stayed out of because partly for issues around legality about IHL. There are big question marks about the lawfulness, as I've just outlined, about those strikes. But the British wanted to keep their drones in play, and crucially, they wanted to stay part of the American kind of process. And Iraq actually was very handy for the Royal Air Force. It gave them a legitimate war they could send their drones to. But at the end of Iraq, when whatever happens with Islamic State, we're still going to go back to that question for the British, what are they going to do with their drones? And I think there's this idea of sometimes with drones, you're looking for the conflict for the drone now. Which I think is a bit troubling. It's,
Some more questions? Yeah, the gentleman here at the front.
This isn't about law, but if you could just comment, there's some pieces that I've read about how drones have successfully radicalized people even where extremist groups failed. Because in these rural communities, a drone comes in and kills some civilians, and then even where the Taliban couldn't radicalize them.
Yeah.
Stuff.
I think the evidence, rather than the hearsay, is actually mixed on this. So there have been some academic studies that say that the radicalization is overstated. I think some has gone the other way. I think what you can say, I think the issue is often not the killing of civilians. It's the fact that this is, I'm talking about the stuff away from the regular battlefield, these are secret wars, and the default position is to lie and deny. So I describe a very awful incident in the book that happened back in 2006, where the CIA almost certainly bombed a school, killing 80 students, of whom 69 were children under the age of 17. Now, we saw what happened in Pakistan last October when the Taliban killed 135 school children. Pakistan went crazy, and understandably so. It was a dreadful atrocity. Now imagine the effect on a part of Pakistan where it's 9 years since a school was destroyed, and we know those children died, and no one will take responsibility for those deaths. The best I could get from the Americans, I got a US official, former US official, to tell me it could have been us, which I thought was very telling. It's the first time any official has ever spoken about that strike in 9 years. It could have been us. The damage, I think, is there's no closure, there's no compensation, there's no recognition of error, there's no recognition of fault. And I think it's that tears into these communities, and because those communities may want the Al-Qaeda and the Taliban out. They might want things to be peaceful, and no more drones, no more bombs, no more Pakistan aircraft coming over and artillery, or drones are just part of the problem in the tribal areas, but they can't have that closure because it's all secret. So I think the evidence is mixed in terms of does it radicalize communities, although former CIA officials told me they always expected it would, and there'd come a point in the drone program where the radicalization outweighed the benefit of the killing. So that's an interesting one. They anticipated that. Whether they've found that or not, I don't know. But I think there are other effects of the killing of civilians which are more long-term and more problematic, which are around denial and refusal to accept responsibility.
On the issue of denial, if anyone is interested in this, there's a very, very good academic study that has just come out by Nita Crawford of Boston University, political scientist. She's written a very nice book called Accountability for Killing, out on Oxford University Press, and that's specifically on America's post-9/11 wars, and exactly on this question of responsibility, in case anyone wants to read up on this. The lady at the back in the blue jacket.
Thank you. I was wondering whether you could comment on and clarify the status of the drone operator, him or herself, under international law. Do they constitute a legitimate target long after they conclude their 9-to-5 duties and go home barbecuing, or are no longer in the battlefield as we know it, but are sort of in the battlefield, or at least engaged in this new theater of law? I would be curious to hear your
That's a great question. It's the view of the CIA's lawyers, of the Pentagon's lawyers, that these remote operators thousands of miles away in places like Nevada, New Mexico and so on are competent. And I think we're into this territory now of the civilian competent. The United States targets civilian competence all the time when they're not directly involved in combat, and I think the Americans would accept, although I don't think the American public would accept, that an off-duty airman or airwoman would be a legitimate target, but the lawyers accept that. And I've heard that from, commented on from a number of folk in terms of the JAGs at the Pentagon and so on. It's there's a big question mark. Is it legitimate for the operator driving her kids to school on the way to carry out a drone mission? Is she a legitimate target? Is the vehicle she's in a legitimate target? These may seem like obvious answers of no, of course she wouldn't be, but of course these are the very things that we, and I say we militarily as well, on the regular battlefield this is happening. These are some of the difficult questions that lawyers are wrestling with, and we are doing that precisely to them. There are occasions when we're targeting them directly outside of hostilities. So it's very uncomfortable territory, I think.
But I guess it also sort of betrays sort of a certain arrogance, right? In the sense that it says, well, I can do these things to you, but you can't do them to me. You can't really effectively strike at drone operators on American territory. But still, there is this question, what would the lone wolf attacker do, or what would a non-state actor do, to carry out a strike on such a target? The gentleman here at the front, in the black jumper, please.
So in international law, you can't just occupy a country, right? You can't just invade with boots and occupied country. But now that we have drones that have the capability of going over territory without, well, boots, what is your opinion, or what do you think the lawfulness of an aerial occupation would be? Like, you could,
it's a great question. I don't think drones can occupy, but I think drones can create vacuums. And I think because they can't hold territory, they can't physically hold territory. And I was going to give an example of that, and this is not just about drones. I think we are in a period at the moment where we have a particular vogue for what I call air wars. We saw it in Libya, we've seen it with the GCC bombing in Yemen at the moment, we've got it in Iraq and Syria right now, of air-only conflicts. It's seen as a way of winning wars. I don't think it's very good at all, personally. But it's being well documented by groups such as Human Rights Watch that one of the problems of airstrikes at the moment in Iraq is they are clearing out Islamic State on the ground, but they're leaving power vacuums, which are then, for example, being filled by Shia militia who are carrying out human rights abuses and atrocities against the Sunni civilian populations. Air can only deliver you so much. It can drive the enemy from the battlefield, but unless you have your troops to fill that vacuum, you're possibly creating as many problems as you think you're actually solving. So I don't think, and again, just to sort of answer tangentially your question, can drones occupy? Islamic State and Al-Qaeda have evolved coping mechanisms precisely to deal with the drones. When Ramadi fell 2 weeks ago, the offensive was launched during a sandstorm. That if you track back every single major offensive by Islamic State in Syria and Iraq over the last year, it's been during bad weather conditions. Why? Because the drones can't fly in bad weather, and the aerial surveillance disappears, and the loss of air superiority levels the battlefield. So we assume that drones give us this all-seeing eye, this complete capability. The reality is actually they're very vulnerable to certain weather conditions, and Al-Qaeda has learned over the years to evolve. They're not going to passively sit there and be bombed. They will find ways to evolve around, and we will have to find ways to adapt back to them. So.
Okay. Thanks. Any more questions? The gentleman here, please.
I just wonder what are the most effective counter-weapons against drones, and whether they might be used by non-state actors. And secondly, are you saying that a facility, let's say in the US or the UK, that operates drones becomes part of a war zone, a hot war zone?
Absolutely I am. In fact, for the book, I visited one of the big drone intelligence bases at Langley Air Force Base, and when I stepped into the actual facility where the intelligence missions were going on, it was made very clear to me that I was entering a war. And in fact, it was quite entertaining because people were moving around. They were in a war and they were on missions and whatever, but they're of course chatting about it. I had a man walk behind me with a red baton and a man walk in front of me with a red baton, and everywhere I walked I had them waving like I was an unclean leper to warn people that there was someone in the war zone who was not cleared to hear classified information. I was in a war. I happened to be in Virginia in the United States. So yeah, the military absolutely accepts that this is a war. These men and women are at war. The difficult thing for those operators is they have to turn that war off every night when they go home to the families. And that's actually proving quite tough on the operators. There's a whole chapter in the book about the psychological effect on drone operators, which is based on conversations with the operators in US Air Force psychologists and so on. So, yeah.
Nick.
Which I'm not sure if your book touches on, and it's about, because I was intrigued with your contrast between Israel and the United States, it's about domestic public opinion over time towards drones, and whether that's been a contrasting experience in both those countries or not.
I don't know the polling in Israel, actually, although I would suspect it's quite hard and pro. The United States, it's usually described as 60% in favour of drone strikes, which is true, counter-terror drone strikes. So at the moment, all the polling's coming back and saying that Americans are in favour of targeted killings away from the battlefield. But I think it's much more nuanced than that, and I think that's really interesting to me as well. When you ask American public opinion the same question and say, but there's a risk that civilians will be killed, the support for drone strikes drops by 25 points. It's a huge drop. We tend to characterize Americans as uncaring, and they're not, of course they're not. They care, and you know, so suddenly we go from 60 to 35. There's only a third of Americans in favour. So, so there is support in both countries. I think it's softer than we think it is, and crucially, it's about only killing the bad guys. I think once people feel that the risk to civilians is too great, and I think we can all understand that the support just drops away quite quickly.
Yeah, we got the no? Okay. Yeah, we got the gentleman over there.
What's the legal position of the RAF personnel who've taken part in the American drone program?
That's a really good question, and I'm not actually sure. There are some really complicated bits of this. So, for example, I did a story for The Guardian last year where I revealed that the CIA had a drone squadron in Nevada called the 17th Reconnaissance Squadron. All the CIA's missions as a civilian intelligence agency are flown by regular US Air Force personnel. And this is a very murky area in law because they are being tasked by civilians. They are military personnel. They're operating beyond the battlefield in dubious legal areas. My understanding is the British crews only ever flew on the conventional battlefield. And when it came to the crunch, the British would come off a mission. They would refuse to kill. And I actually quote one very gung-ho drone pilot in the book who yanks a British crew off a drone mission, puts an American crew on who then carry out the kill that the British had refused. So there are these tensions. But the British have the right to say no. The Americans have the right to say no. And they have used that. But the British have always been careful to keep their personnel away from the stuff away from the regular battlefield. And I think that's been smart of them, personally.
Okay, we got time for one more question.
I did ask a question about what are the best counter-weapons.
Oh, you did? Yes, sorry. So the best counter-weapons. There have been some crazy ones, literally tinfoil hats. Al-Qaeda. There was when Al-Qaeda in the Maghreb was driven out a couple of years ago from Timbuktu, Associated Press found a 40-page Arabic document which was basically countermeasures for the drones. And there is a whole chapter in the book called Countermeasures and Critiques, which sort of lays it out. Plug, and John will be very happy to sell you discounted books at the end. 25% off. Some of them are quite effective. So they, terrorists know to operate undercover, underground, using bad weather. As I was saying, bad weather is probably the single greatest deterrent to drone use. It's the one thing that will force the drones from the sky. But putting glass on roofs of cars, that's a big one. Anything that will reflect the infrared signal, for example. So, and also Al-Qaeda, they're not dumb. They've put a lot of energy into hacking the drones. They want to get access to them. They want to commandeer the drones. We saw with the Iranians a couple of years ago, they managed to capture, in fact, a very sophisticated CIA drone called the RQ-170, very technologically capable, which the Iranians immediately sold to the Chinese, the technology for that. So it's an industry in its own right, the countermeasures required to beat the drones. And I don't think there's a single measure, but the most effective is a rainy day or a sandstorm.
Right, which gives us sort of a nice image. I think during the Cold War, the British government issued advice in case of a nuclear attack, you should sort of put sort of a briefcase on your head. As you can see in the wars of the future where we all walk sort of around with tinfoil hats to kind of prevent the drones from attacking us. So, Chris, thanks very much for what was an excellent and really interesting talk. Thanks so much to everyone for coming. Chris, of course, will be selling some books, and I gather he will also hope to sell some. So please grab a copy of the book.
Thank you for coming. Thanks very much.